Hello, welcome. It's good to be here with you today. I've got a question for you. When I ask you to think about what are you most afraid of right now? What are your biggest worries, your biggest fears? What's your reaction? Are you like, Kit, I can go ahead and tell you what those are, no problem. I can identify them and talk about them. Or do you want to go and run and hide under your covers? Today, I want to talk about a strategy for working with fears and anxieties, the worst case scenarios. And specifically, I want to help you see this as a tool that you can use when you're worrying a lot or overthinking. I talked about in my video last week, which I'll link to below. I talked about strategies to downregulate the nervous system and get the parasympathetic nervous system on board as one of the components to helping with overthinking. This is another strategy. This is a direct strategy to help with worry and overthinking itself. So if you didn't watch my video last week, go ahead and check that out so that you can activate your parasympathetic nervous system and downregulate your nervous system. And then come back and use this strategy to help with the worry, the overthinking itself. So I am Dr. Kit Slies. I am a life coach and licensed psychologist, and I'm here because I want to inspire all my perfectionists out there, my anxious achievers, to feel more calm, more confident while holding clear boundaries for yourself. So the strategy that I want to talk about today is not my own. I didn't make it up. It's actually a strategy that's used a lot in cognitive behavioral therapy. If you Google it, you'll find other folks talk about it. I kind of put my own little twist on it kind of here and there, but it's called play the script to the end. I call it the worst case scenario strategy because that's what it is though. We're dealing with the worst case scenario. So going back to what was your reaction when I asked you to think about what your fears are and everything? If you had the reaction that you didn't want to think about them, you wanted to go hide under the covers, you are probably more in the normal. So when we think about anxiety or things that cause fear in us, it is very common to have an avoidance reaction. If we think about that fight or flight response that gets activated when we're under stress, that is the flight piece. It is normal to want to flee from things that are fear or anxiety provoking. And fear and anxiety are not the exact same thing, but they create the same or similar response in our nervous system. The difference between fear and anxiety, fear would be like if there is an actual life-threatening thing right in front of you, a lion, a near car accident, something like that, that is the fear response. Anxiety is having that response in reaction to thoughts about those things happening potentially in the future. Okay, so going back to that tendency to avoid it, that is normal. If you maybe are more in the tendency to fight, which a lot of my anxious achievers might have that response as well. They might see something that instigates some anxiety or some worry, and they're like going head into it, like, I'm going to take this thing on. But you can still use this strategy because a lot of you folks still end up in this overthinking trap. But what I want to say about the avoidance piece is that when we don't let ourselves go into the absolute worst case scenario, that fear reaction, that anxiety reaction is going to keep coming back. Because by avoiding it, we might be in the moment de-intensifying the anxiety feeling by ignoring it. Oh, no, I'm just going to pretend this isn't really a worry that I have. Okay, bye. Just leave me alone. But deep down, it is still a worry. So we're reinforcing that behavior of avoidance because in that moment, again, the anxiety de-intensifies, but later it crops back up because of our just kind of constant mental chatter. It's actually still a concern or a worry that you have. It's going to keep coming back to you. So this worst case scenario, play the script to the end strategy, nips that in the bud. It kind of, more than that, it kind of digs in and roots the thing. We take it out from the root. We take the fear out from the root, so that you don't have to keep replaying it over and over and over again. And if you are more of that approach strategy or more of a fighter, this is just a good tool to put in your arsenal so that you're not overthinking all of the possible directions that approaching it and fighting it, taking it on could take you, and that leads to overthinking. So what is it? So the first step is to identify what it is that you're worrying about. What is the fear? And what is the thought that keeps coming back to you, okay, over and over and over again? And why is that so scary for you, or so anxiety provoking? So this could be something like, let's say you were making a change in your job, okay? Something that you maybe were contemplating or you knew was coming down the line and was going to happen, and you were having a lot of anxiety about it. Maybe you knew you were going to have to switch departments. Maybe you knew that you were going to have to quit your job and do something else. You could be having a lot of worry and anxiety about that. Or maybe you're just contemplating it and you can't make that decision. So identify what the worst case scenario for you would be when you switch to that other department, when you quit, or if you were to quit. What is the absolute worst case thing that could happen to you from doing that? And rather than avoiding it, we want to play it out. Okay? When we play it out, we're going to be asking ourselves a couple of questions. The first question is, and the biggest question is, if the worst case scenario, if the worst possible fear were to happen, how would you deal? How would you cope with it? Because what we're doing now is that we are taking away some of the power of that worst case scenario. We're saying, yeah, okay, that is scary and gross, and maybe it would be hard and horrible, and sure, all of those things. But if I had to deal with the worst case scenario, I could probably get through it. Yeah, it would suck. It'd be hard. I could figure it out. So with the example that I'm using, maybe for the person who has to switch over to a different department or a different office or something like that, maybe they're worried about, they've heard rumors about the people there, and it's going to be a toxic culture or something like that. If you had to quit your job or something, there's maybe some financial worries, things like that. But you figure out in your mind, how would you cope with those things? How could you cope with a toxic culture? Maybe you decide that, okay, this is a temporary situation, that's just, I'll figure out my next move after that. If it is toxic, I'll just do my best to kind of stay above it and kind of stay surface level with folks, and go talk to my therapist about how to deal with those relationships and communication styles and all of that, setting boundaries. Okay. If you had to quit your job, you would be thinking about, okay, here's my game plan for how I'm going to look for another one. Here's how I'll deal with a financially difficult time. Here's the resources that I will call to action. Okay. So you play all of those different things out. And you might come to some areas that feel really hard and feel like, okay, I'm not really sure how I would cope with that. But in that moment, you have to say, okay, that's when I would really engage in problem solving, or I would reach out to other people or resources in my community to help me with that problem solving. Okay. How would you deal with it emotionally? What tools would you use to get your parasympathetic system on board? That go back to my video from last week too for that one, right? Who would you talk to kind of help you deal with the emotions of that and just the difficulty of it? So that is the crux of play the script to the end. But I take it a step further. So what you want to do after you call to mind all your capacity to cope and deal with hard stuff, and maybe even thinking about, okay, I have dealt with hard things before. Maybe I have dealt with harder situations and gotten through them, or just other hard situations. Call to mind how you cope through all of those, right? Okay. Then the next step in this worst case scenario activity is to let yourself entertain what is the best possible scenario. What's the best possible outcome? You could move to that other department and find out this team is way better than the one that you left, and the rumors were all false. Somebody created these rumors, so not everyone want to go flocking to this other department. Or you quit your job and you find a new one that, again, is even better than the one that you had before. You get better work-life balance or some other perk that just is exactly what you needed. Okay. So now you've got the best case scenario on one end, and you've got the worst case scenario on the other end. And then you can even entertain some possibilities in between, because we got a whole range of possibilities. Okay. So many possibilities lie before us in our lives. And you want to say, okay, well, if I did have to move departments, maybe it could be about the same and not that big of a deal, but not quite the best case scenario, right? Maybe I would move and there'd be positive things about it, but other negative things about it. Okay. Maybe if I had to quit my job or if I got laid off or whatever, I would get another job that was mediocre. Okay. So we want to let our brain go to the full range of possibilities, because our brains tend to focus on the negative as a protective mechanism. And there is a lot of value in entertaining the worst case scenario if you're letting yourself go to what coping tools you're going to use and how to problem solve and get through that, right? There's a lot of value in doing that. If you are approaching the worst case scenario in that regard, you are letting your power come forth, letting yourself figure out how I'm going to grow from this situation, entertain the possibility of growth. Okay. You are maybe going to be more prepared for some of those worst case scenarios, because maybe there's a couple of things you want to do beforehand to prepare for that possibility, if they make sense and they're not overdoing it. Okay. So our brains focus on the negative. It's a survival mechanism. We evolved to do this. We evolved to be able to attend to life-threatening information in our environment so that we can survive. Just unfortunately, today, a lot of that information that our brain focuses on isn't actually life-threatening. It's just stressful, but our brain can still prioritize the negative. So when we ask ourselves, what is the best case scenario? We are creating different neural pathways, okay, as opposed to just strengthening the same neural pathway of going to the negative over and over and over again. We're creating different neural pathways so that we maybe have some more balance in our thinking when we're thinking about these possibilities. Okay, so step one was to identify the fear. Step two is to play out the worst case scenario, play the script to the end, and identify your coping tools. Step three is the best case scenario. Step four is to identify some scenarios in between. The final step here, step five, is to then ask yourself, what feels most likely? Because we can engage in a lot of distorted thinking in terms of letting ourselves think that the worst case scenario is the most likely. And again, that has to do with just that that's our tendency to go there. And so that we overinflate that as a possibility. Most of the time when we ask ourselves this question, okay, what's most likely, best case, worst case, or something in between? It's usually something in between, or sometimes it's the best case scenario. Very rarely do I see folks go through this activity and feel like it's the worst case scenario. If that's okay, if that's the case, that's still okay though, because you have got all of your coping tools that you are preparing to use if that is going to happen. Okay, so we're just taking away some of the power of that being this big scary fear. It's sort of like drawing the curtain back from Oz, right? It's like there's this big scary monster under the bed until we kind of draw the sheets back, draw the curtain back and say, oh, okay, still maybe kind of scary or weird or dusty down there, but we've got our monster spray now and we know how to spray it down there or clean out the dust bunnies from under there. That's what we're doing with this exercise. If you go through this exercise, pay attention to yourself, check in with yourself about how the fear or the anxiety feels to you. Maybe rank it on a scale from 1 to 10 at the beginning and then again at the end. Most folks who do this find that they aren't quite as anxious about it anymore, not quite as worried about it. They feel more relief. Not always so. So if you're still high up there on the anxiety, then my recommendation is to go to some things that you are grateful for in this moment. And this is not to avoid, we still have your action plan coping tools over here, but it's just to, again, kind of create those other neural pathways to focus on there are other things in the environment or in your world that are still positive. Again, these can be really small things. They could be that the chair you're sitting in is comfortable. They could be you got a good night's sleep the night before, or you enjoyed a cup of tea today, or whatever. They just do not have to be mind-blowing things. They just get your brain into a different mental space than the constant worry, 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 worry. So that is a specific strategy to help with overthinking. Use that in conjunction with rest, relaxation, again, down regulation of the nervous system and getting that parasympathetic nervous system on board. And I hope that you found this helpful. If you found this helpful and you want to tell me, maybe leave a comment below just so I can know that I'm on the right track. And until next time, I hope you have a good time just trying to relax and not live in the worst case scenario. And I will see you next time. Bye for now.